welcome to Pluribus Fireside Chats. Not as good as FDR's, but hey, it's something. So this is the first podcast of the year 2023. Ignore the fact that I am recording this in 2022, and the news stories are from 2022. The first true podcast of 2023 will be the next one, as it will actually basically exclusively involve stuff that is going on in 2023. But not only with the main subject, but also with some of the things that go on in this episode. We do have some interesting tidbits going on about how, this year's theme is kind of. First, I guess we should do one bit of housekeeping. I made a video, reacting to Bana Banata's reaction to my video, reacting to, I guess, his entire presence. Sadly, it doesn't look like this one is going to be a VOD, so I guess this, me linking the Twitch stream and the reaction to his stream will be the things that prove that it happened. I was hoping that I would be able to, comment on the VOD just to explain things, because I really didn't want to just go into the emails and be like, hey bro, whatever. I probably won't even interact with him, it doesn't matter that much. He got his fill, I got my fill, whatever. I really only wanted to bring up the fact that he didn't even get into any of the salient criticisms of him. But again, it doesn't really matter. With that out of the way, let's get right into the news. First, we're going to be talking about a big update in the Bolivian, situation. There isn't a recent Bolivian situation. I'm talking about the coup that happened in 2019. Because, lo and behold, one of the forefront leaders of the coup, Luis Fernando Camacho, has been arrested on charges of terrorism. Now, first of all, good riddance. Who cares? Nobody should give a crap about this guy being arrested. But, of course, media punditry has been a little bit, shall we say, generous to Camacho. For starters, the article I'm reading this from right now is Bolivian police detain prominent opposition leader as tensions flare. And here's some other news stories that I basically tried to talk about this. Bolivian protests, opposition governor's arrests, stirs anger. Bolivian court sentences opposition leader to 4 months ahead of trial. Bolivian opposition leader Luis Fernando Camacho kidnapped by the government. Bolivian opposition leader held on quote-unquote terrorism charges. Bolivian leader brutally kidnapped as tensions flare. Bolivian opposition leader Luis Fernando Camacho arrested on terrorism charges. They're doing the thing where it's this prominent guy who's an opposition person in, Bolivia, he's being arrested by the left-wing government. That's a bit weird, that's a bit sussy. And also ignoring the fact, for example, one of the big things is, this is one part of the article that I'm reading again. It says, an October arrest warrant accused Camacho of terrorism without giving more details. If you ignore the fact that he was literally one of the leaders in charge of a fascist organization that helped overthrow Evo Morales, I think that kind of qualifies, to be honest, especially considering, the far-right people who overthrew Morales did do a lot of terrorism. In fact, they've kind of done a little bit of terrorism with the arrest of Camacho. I'm not kidding, in the sense that he was a member of a fascist organization. He's literally a member of he used to be the leader of the Santa Cruz Youth Union and remain actively part of, their activities up to the coup in Bolivia. It's the dude really 100% deserved the situation. It was surprising that it took them this long to get to it. And the only opposition leader that there were 3 main opposition leaders of against Evo Morales. There was Janine Áñez, Camacho, and Mesa. The only one you can make an argument of those 3 that you'd be okay, that's kind of sus, would be if Mesa was arrested. And I don't think Mesa has been arrested because Mesa followed all the rules. He engaged in protests against Evo Morales, and he called for, technically the legal parameters for declaring that the election was bad. Meanwhile, Áñez took power that she was not allowed to have And Camacho was very much affiliated with far-right organizations that did very illegal activities. So, like, it makes sense that those two would be in jail. Anyway, speaking of right-wing opposition that is kind of failing, something interesting is going on in Venezuela. The Venezuelan opposition has voted to remove Juan Guaido from the small legs of power that he had. So here is what happened. The National Assembly that was elected in the 2015 elections, if I remember correctly, it was the elections, not 2015, maybe 2015, it was the elections, it was the midterm elections right before the 2018 Venezuelan presidential election. It was the first time since Chavez took power that that was actually like a viable opposition. And they didn't really do much with that until the Venezuelan election where Nicolas Maduro won a second term. And then, of course, they did that whole, like, oh, Juan Guaido is the legitimate president of Venezuela. And then there was that whole debacle where, like, the leaders that really hated Venezuela, of course, wanted Guaido to be considered the leader of Venezuela, and all the people who liked Venezuela considered Maduro the legitimate president. And then eventually, due to the fact that this opposition was sort of mainly focused on this, than actually maintaining, like, a proper, actual political opposition, the opposition bloc essentially fell apart in the Congress, and they boycotted the election. PSUV won overwhelmingly, and then they cried foul, like, you're rigging it against us, you didn't run. And essentially everything was at a standstill because there was really nothing the opposition could do. They basically just went around going like, we need to fix Venezuela. Maduro, you need to come to us and we need to negotiate this. And Maduro was just like, no. So, like, and that was the biggest problem because, like, even if you wanted to make the argument that they did follow the rules, there was nothing they could do. So literally all Juan Guaido was doing was basically going on a speaking tour about, like, how whatever. Like, he was just essentially just going on a speaking tour. But, as you may have noticed, things have started shifting in regards to foreign policy regarding Venezuela. You see, with the Biden administration taking a more soft stance on, like, the socialist Latin American countries, you know, all of a sudden, and like all of the other countries that have been doing terribly with the Ukraine war, and the fact that all the Russian oil that they used to get is now no longer flowing in, all of a sudden they're like super buddy-buddy with, like, Maduro, and Guaido has essentially been left hung to dry. And through that, Biden and other people were able to negotiate some form of, like, democracy reform in Venezuela or whatever. Like, basically, it seemed like they, with a more friendly relationship, now, Maduro was more open to some of the suggestions that other countries were giving about their political system. And as such, Juan Guaido was not really needed, so we just started casually hearing about him less and less. And now we're at the point where he literally has no political power. Well, I mean, he had no political power already, but his political power has gotten to the point where it is substantially less than what it is, especially with the fact that in 2024, Venezuela will be holding their next presidential elections. And one of the things that has been floated is the idea that Nicolas Maduro might not run for that next election, and he instead might give that position to, like, a different PSUV person. So many people are saying that maybe there could be further reforms for Venezuela that are not needed there. And if you've been paying attention to some Venezuelan politics, you may notice that the opposition, when they're not being stupid, they actually can be viable. So now it looks like the Washington consensus is try to build up the Venezuelan opposition throughout the actual democratic elections, rather than trying to hedge all their bets on, we need to get Juan Guaido to come back and be the true leader of Venezuela. So now, that opposition has crumbled, but the opposition in Venezuela that has actually been trying to, like, build political power, they have actually been moving forward, and actually been gaining some steam. So, I guess things might be going in a different direction for Venezuela soon. All Juan Guaido and his group are essentially going to do is basically try to manage all the foreign assets that Venezuela owns, because during that whole debacle, like, a bunch of foreign banks who had, like, Venezuelan money. He basically just decided that they're going to keep the Venezuelan money and give it to Guaido. Anyway, there's not much more to say. We'll have to wait and see how things turn out for Venezuela. Speaking of waiting to see how things turn out, that's something that we're going to have to see for a Congress member that has actually been gaining some steam, even in groups that I might not like. Okay, so for those who don't know, Jamie Raskin is a progressive member of Congress who, he's been like the head of like the January 6th committee, I think, and he's become sort of like a face within like the anti-Donald Trump movement, especially recently with, again, the January 6th committee, which has steadily earned him favor with like liberals and stuff. It's even gotten to the point where Jamie Raskin has actually been floated as a potential 2024 presidential candidate, or he would run for Senate, has sadly just announced that he has diffuse large B-cell lymphoma, a curable form of cancer. Like, it's apparently, like, again, early stages, I guess, and this isn't actually his first cancer diagnosis. He had colon cancer previously. It sucks that just as Raskin started getting like notoriety and fame, he gets this very sad diagnosis. But Raskin's a fighter. I know for a fact that he'll pull it off. This would be a very dated segment if he doesn't pull it off. Not much else to say except speedy recovery for Raskin, and hopefully I'll see him in a different office by 2024. Now, the last major story is one that I have not paid attention to because I don't fly planes. If I did, I probably would have paid attention to this much sooner, but apparently this is getting somewhat political ramifications, so that'll be interesting. Okay, so an airline by the name of Southwest Airlines has been going through a lot of problems. You see, ever since December 22nd, they have canceled more than half of their typical flights, and according to this, by Wednesday, about 87% of all canceled flights in the United States were from Southwest alone. This is due to like the recent like ice and like snowstorms and stuff. But here's basically all of the here's a graph that I have of like all of the airlines comparatively. So first, Alaska, this 22nd. They had 3% of their flights canceled. Then 23rd, 15%, 13%, 5%, 4%, 3%, 1%. So as you can see, and this is like consistent, American Airlines 5%, 25, 11, 1, 1, 2, 1. Delta 6, 22, 19, 15, 9, 2, 0. Frontier 14, 3, 2, 1, 1, 1, 0. Spirit 3, 3, 3, 6, 6, 30. United 11, 21, 16, 8, 6, 30. But for Southwest, in that same time frame, it's been 17, 30, 35, 33, 66, 72, and 63. And people have started to notice that this is just a big trend that Southwest has had ever since COVID-19 has even begun. And one of the big things that has been going on is that a lot of politicians have been getting mad at Pete Buttigieg. Why Pete Buttigieg? Because since you've all more than likely forgotten, Pete Buttigieg is actually our Secretary of Transportation. For those who don't know what the Secretary of Transportation is, they're the ones who head the Department of Transportation, whose job it is to, quote, develop and coordinate policies that will provide an efficient and economically national transportation system with due regard for need, the environment, and national defense. Now you might be wondering, why is Pete Buttigieg the Secretary of Transportation when there were more cabinet positions that he was offered that he might have actually done a better job at, like Secretary of Veterans Affairs or Ambassador to the UN? You see, as the Secretary of Transportation, Buttigieg is actually the person who could actually try to handle the situation. He's literally the guy in charge of all of the transportation within the United States. And Ro Khanna actually called Pete Buttigieg out about this, saying, nearly 6 months ago, Bernie Sanders and I called for Buttigieg to implement fines and penalties on airlines for canceling flights. Why were these recommendations not followed? This mess with Southwest could have been avoided. We need bold action. Referencing the fact that him and Bernie wrote a letter asking Pete to make it so that the airlines who cancel or extremely delay flights would have to compensate the people not only for their tickets, but for all of their expenses that they would need on the trip. Other people within like the progressive wing, like Nina Turner, Katie Porter, David Sirota, have also echoed similar sentiments. And as expected, liberals literally decided to take a completely different interpretation, stating that Nina Turner was homophobic for critiquing Pete Buttigieg, and that Ro Khanna was only calling out Pete Buttigieg because he is gearing up for a Senate bid in 2024, which is ironic considering the only reason Pete Buttigieg was put on the Secretary of Transportation was so that he could be in the prime position to run for president in, say, 2028, because he literally has no experience in transportation. Like, there's literally no reason why Pete Buttigieg should be in that position. Like, any other person, like, this is the thing. Most other people who become president are smart enough to, at the very least, they still obviously want to do the thing where it's like they're gearing up for someone to run for president in the next cycle, but it's like they'll at the very least be smart enough to put someone who knows what they're doing in a position where they can do what they're doing. But literally, this is like one of the more blatant ones where it's like he's clearly just putting him in a position that he is completely unqualified for, just for the sake of, like, thank you for endorsing me in 2020, and now I have given you a stepping stone to run for president, because that was Pete Buttigieg's plan the whole time. He was just gearing up, like, he was the small town mayor who had literally nothing going for him, and now he has gone on the level where he is literally somehow one of the forefront leaders of the Democratic Party. And all it took was running for the DNC chair and failing, and then running for president and failing. And now he gets to be in a position that he's completely unqualified for, and he literally doesn't have to do anything for, because he has not stepped in the office ever since 2021, because this is literally the most blatant and obvious, like, thing to get brownie points for having a gay member of your cabinet, and also having a stepping stone for Pete to run for president in a future cycle, or run for Senate, or whatever. It doesn't matter what position he runs for. He's just now in a position where now he can, like, claim, like, whatever, because that's the politics game. Hillary Clinton was literally at Obama's throat so much that she started a conspiracy theory that haunts him to this day, and yet he graciously gives her not only a position in his cabinet, but also literally the most powerful position in the cabinet. Because now all of a sudden, she's no longer Senator Clinton, she's now Secretary Clinton. And being a member of the executive branch makes more Americans think that you're able to lead the executive branch. Anyways, Pete Buttigieg sucks. Let's move on to the main topic of this video. If you're familiar with this channel, or me, there's a good chance that you are sitting there going, haven't you done this before? Why, yes, I have. I've done this twice. I did the first one rather early on in my channel, and then I did a second one with Sunflower Socialist. And after I did it twice, I thought that I was kind of done with the topic and I would just be able to move on and do whatever. But there was always something about it that it didn't feel finished. I don't know why. But I decided to basically look over the elections, like all of them, one more time, just to check and see any other candidates that were interesting or whatever. And what I ended up finding was that there were actually quite a number of interesting candidates that I never really even considered looking at. And when I was looking into, like, a lot of the people who were running and a lot of the people who, how things were, I started thinking, maybe I judged it a little too, early. Like, there's some candidacies that I started giving a second glance to, and I'm like, this one actually might have been an interesting choice to run for president. Or, literally anything. Like, it could have been like, oh, this person seems like slightly interesting to run for president. Or I think this person actually, after reading a little bit more about them, I completely changed my mind about how a candidate is. So now I would go in a completely different direction. So with this one, I decided to do this topic one more time. To celebrate 5 years, this topic we'll be talking about it one more time. And this is probably going to be the last time I discuss this topic. Unless this channel, I guess, to the point where it's like 5 years later or like 10 years later, and there's like a lot more presidential elections that I have to talk about for this thing. But I think generally at this point, this is going to be the last one, because I think after looking through all of these candidacies and all of these people and how all of the races and stuff pan out, I do genuinely think that I pretty much nailed how this like who I actually would have probably voted for in each presidential election. Now, one of the big things that you should notice when I say this is that this sort of like thing, like who would I have voted for in every single presidential election? You see, I think I first got this question when I had a Quora account and I just started like posting stuff on there. And I just thought it was an interesting topic that I would make into a full-fledged like podcast. But one of the big things that I always knew from day one, that when it says who would I have voted for in every presidential election, there are a lot of factors in which the people that I will say do not necessarily qualify. You see, because very early on in the United States' like history, you had to be a rich white landowner male to vote, and I am not any of those. So of course I would not have been able to vote. There are a couple of elections where the state that I live in were one, it wasn't a state, so I couldn't have voted in that election cycle. There's also some candidates that weren't on the ballot in certain states, but I've never really been all in the like nitty gritty of it. What this is actually saying is like, which of the candidates in the cycle do you most align with? Which one would you have wanted to throw your support behind? Even if you couldn't have, which one would you have wanted to support? And again, a lot of elections, so there are a lot of different things. And you'll even notice just how, like especially when I mentioned, like, when I talked about, like, in my party switch video, it's like some of the people who would necessarily be considered, like, the left wing might not necessarily be the people who people like me would vote for now. Like, I think there's one example that you'll probably think of, and also a lot of people, like, there are a lot of candidates that don't necessarily fit within, like, my political ideology or whatever, but for reasons either abstract or very obvious, I still probably would have supported them. But anyways, let's just get into it. Who would I have voted for in every single United States presidential election in history? And I'll actually try to explain my reasons why, in case you haven't seen any of the original videos, and especially if they are candidates that I did not get to, like ones that I would not have voted for, like ones that I said that I wouldn't vote for in the past, but now I've changed my mind. Okay, so first is the 1788/89 presidential election. I don't think anybody in the politics or history YouTube sphere has said anything except George Washington. To be blunt, it literally is just following a crowd. Like, pick a winner. Let's pick a winner. And Washington, like, at the time and even now, he's basically like, there really is not anything, like, I mean, aside from the fact that he owns slaves, and, no, I think that's literally it. Aside from the fact that he owns slaves, and I guess that he was part of, like, the rich land-owning elite, like, those are really the only faults with George Washington. But it's like, of the people who were in that crowd, it's like, I guess he was the better of them. Especially since he was part of, like, a specific crowd of, like, the Federalists, which were sort of like the party of the rich white people. Whereas the Anti-Federalists were, like, the rich white people. But Washington, of course, had, like, a little bit of both of them in him, so that he generally just didn't really have any issues. Anybody could look at George Washington and say, like, yeah, we should vote for him. And it should come as no shock. The same situation would happen in 1792. No major issues with Washington. I think in that cycle, literally, the Anti-Federalists and the Federalists nominated him for president. And he also, again, like the previous one, won basically unanimously. So there's really no point in bucking with a crowd. 1796 is where we get the introductions of our first sort of actual political parties that are running against each other. And this is the first one where I'll announce that I picked a loser. I pick Thomas Jefferson. Even though I've acknowledged that Thomas Jefferson is definitely not, definitely when I started the channel, I definitely had a lot more of a favorable view of Thomas Jefferson than I do now. Objectively, of the people who were founding fathers who were running for president, he still was probably the best, honestly. Most of the other ones, again, were part of, that Federalist crowd, especially, when we come to find out, John Adams was literally one of the worst presidents the United States has ever had. So basically, preventing him from even getting that one term would be beneficial for the United States. So yes, to a degree, it is lesser of two evils. Yeah, sure, I know Thomas Jefferson is a person who rapes slaves and owns slaves and is a lot of bad, but he also has a lot of favorable qualities. The separation of church and state is one of the big ones that is very interesting for Jefferson. His sort of veneer of advocating for, the people, which is a thing that still sort of influences, the political left today. Honestly, if anybody should have been a president, it should have been Thomas Paine, but again, he wasn't really an option. 1800, we get our second win, but Jefferson manages to win with my support again. By this time, we all see that John Adams is a terrible president, so as such, time to get rid of him with someone who is slightly better than him. 1804, even though Jefferson has done a little bit of some of the bad things, he's done a lot of bad things within his administration, he still is a decent option, all things considered. So I still have to go with Thomas Jefferson. By this point, I am basically a diehard member of the Democratic Republicans. I am still shocked that is the official name that historians have chosen for the party. They could literally have chosen anything else. The Jeffersonians, the Republicans, whatever, the Democrats. If this group essentially evolved into the Democrats, why not just call them the Democrats? Regardless, I'm still a Jefferson fan. For 1808, I am still in the Democratic-Republican line, and I vote for James Madison. Literally, the biggest problem that I have with, the Federalists, honestly, is, truly, I would probably have been fine with the Federalists if they had chosen, the Federalists, the fact of the matter is, there really was not that much difference between the Democratic-Republicans and the Federalists. It's basically a similar thing to how people say there isn't much difference between the Democrats and the Republicans. Essentially, they are a political class that is basically the rich white people of the nation, the bourgeois of the nation. They are the ones in charge. The only difference is which part of the country they appealed to more. And the Democratic Republicans, they at the very least were able to appeal to the common man in a way. Do I necessarily agree with all the ways they appeal to the common man? Not necessarily. But they were able to have that appeal, and that appeal still resonates. Even though, to a degree, the Federalists do have some better policies in retrospect, the Federalists being, super pro-tariff. But the thing is, they were pro-tariff because that would help their own businesses, not because it would actually be beneficial in the long run, because of, to protect from foreign aid, businesses. And one more thing is that they basically picked the worst person to lead with. For Federalists, it's literally okay, we have all these people to run for president as a Federalist. So, who should be the first one to be a Federalist? Okay, we're gonna pick John Adams. Hopefully he won't tarnish the Federalist reputation forever. He would then tarnish the Federalist reputation for the rest of history. Okay, so 1816, again, Democratic-Republican line, we're gonna go with James Monroe. Now here is one thing I will say. Rufus King was the only Federalist that had me looking in his direction. Because he did oppose the expansion of slavery. That is one thing that is definitely okay, that's something. But again, I can't necessarily trust the Federalists. In 1820, I won't have to worry about that because the Federalists have essentially disappeared, and James Monroe is the only candidate. He runs and basically wins unanimously. I'm not even going to pretend that, I'd be one of the people who votes for one of the other people to stand up for. No, I probably would have just followed the crowd, honestly. Because it was the era of good feelings. Monroe did a pretty good job, all things considered. And by 1824, again, the whole block of like the Federalists have essentially disappeared. The ideas behind the Federalists versus the Democratic Republicans are still there, but by this time, they have all basically merged into one ideology. Like, all the good aspects of the Federalists had been sucked up by the Democratic Republicans, and it makes me say that I'll actually be able to vote for John Adams, except put a Quincy in there. And yeah, John Quincy Adams is actually a decent president. He was able to take all the good aspects of Federalists and all the good aspects of Democratic Republicans and actually merge them into a coherent ideology. And I don't know if it's something that happens in this cycle or if that happens in the next cycle, but honestly, Andrew Jackson, like, I'll be real, Andrew Jackson sucks. He's terrible. I'm not even gonna pretend to like put myself in the shoes of someone at the time, like, oh, but at the very least he appeals to comment. And it's like, no, he's literally just an atrocious president. He's downright atrocious, and I'm a populist guy, but it's like, this is definitely right-wing populism, and I would have stayed down that path for the 1828 election and continued to support John Quincy Adams. Jackson did some things that would be fine, but that all the bad things he does, like, it's not like a Thomas Jefferson situation. It's like, basically, Thomas Jefferson and Andrew Jackson are in somewhat similar boats, but the difference is, Jefferson, he was able to have, like, more benefits that outweighed the bad things, but Jackson, quite the opposite. And I can't see myself supporting him in the 1832 election either. So, I'll have to vote for Henry Clay. If only enough people had actually said that at the time, then Henry Clay would have actually been president. Like, legitimately, I should probably do a video on Henry Clay, though I think Mr. B already did a video about Henry Clay, but Henry Clay is such a fascinating figure in the sense that the man literally was so influential and yet just so much of an afterthought. Like, even if it's just for pity, you should have supported Henry Clay in this election, man. 1836 is where we get some interesting developments. Now the small faction that Henry Clay and John Quincy Adams have tried to do, that failed, and now it's basically rebranded into a new political ideology, the Whigs, and a new group, the Whig Party. The Whig Party decided to do something incredibly weird and ran like 4 candidates across the United States in an effort to try and take the House of Representatives because they had like a massive amount of people in the House. So the solution is deadlock the presidential election and make the only viable options Whigs so that you would be able to vote for the Whig to win because they didn't think they had enough viable political infrastructure to run a nationwide campaign. In actuality, they probably should have just ran one candidate because I think it would have generally worked well for them, and the candidate I would have chosen for them would have probably been Daniel Webster. I know he wasn't the Whig in the state that I lived in, but genuinely, Daniel Webster really should have been the candidate that they chose to run a nationwide campaign. I really don't see why they didn't just choose one strong candidate instead of 4 weak candidates. Though I guess technically it was 2 strong candidates and 2 weak candidates, because the 2 strong candidates, one actually became president, and Daniel Webster was a prominent political figure otherwise. Now you see, up to this point, I have elected candidates that were, viable, and actually had a chance to win. For the next couple of cycles, I decided to mostly stick with ideology and basically do 20/20 hindsight, really. For 1840, I have basically decided to snub the mainstream political candidates and vote for James G. Birney of the Liberty Party, because the Liberty Party was the only abolitionist party. And the same thing goes for 1844. I only choose James G. Birney because the Liberty Party was the only abolitionist political party in the United States. Neither of these candidacies went well, but they did try. Now, 1848 is where things get interesting, because in 1848, Martin Van Buren actually decided to run for president under a new political party called the Free Soil Party. You see, the Free Soil Party were a group of people who were the moderate wing of the Liberty Party. While they weren't explicitly abolitionist, they were against the expansion of slavery. And Martin Van Buren decided that he was going to run for their nomination, get it, and then basically try to run with that in his, belt. However, this is where you start to notice a little bit of my ideology again seeping in, because most people who are in this field who probably would have, who try to strongman themselves and, strongman it and be like, I would have voted for the abolitionist candidates, they would have probably flipped to vote for Martin Van Buren in this cycle. But I don't roll that way, because Martin Van Buren, he already was president at some point, and he really didn't do anything to try to stop the expansion of slavery or flat out abolish slavery, so I can't trust him to do that when it comes to the presidential election. So I would have stuck to the radical roots and decided to stick with Garrett Smith of the Liberty Party. I know he had basically zero chance, but I'm still sticking with him. Now, the 1852 election, things were a little bit different. The Liberty Party had essentially been swallowed up by the Free Soil Party. You see, it was still technically around, but it was basically a shell of its former self. And thankfully, the Free Soil Party actually was smart in one aspect. They actually did decide to nominate an abolitionist for their presidential candidate, John P. Hale. While he was not as prominent as Martin Van Buren, I would have still voted for him, because John P. Hale was the first openly abolitionist senator, and that is 100% worth everybody's support. The 1856 election begins a trend that we'll see a little bit of in the future, but something that you'll never hear me even insinuate in the modern day. But in 1856, I would have been one of the most radical Republicans in the world, because that was when the Republican Party had just begun and was now in the formation of being a viable party. I think it literally just became the second party of the United States. And if not, this is the election that would make it that way, because I don't remember, but in the immediate before of this, the Whigs, and there was a smaller abolitionist party called the Opposition Party, the Free Soilers. They basically all were just we don't know what to do, so they all just merged into the Republican Party. And in this cycle, they went with one of their most radical abolitionist members as their candidate, John C. Fremont. And Fremont really is a pretty good candidate who would have 100% earned my support. And now 1860 is where things change a little bit. You see, the Republicans decided to moderate themselves a bit and pick someone who was less radical than Fremont. And they chose Abraham Lincoln. The idea behind this was that Abraham Lincoln, being more moderate, would have then probably meant that he would have been more palatable to the South. The problem was, that didn't end up happening because the radicals had rightfully tainted the image of the Republican Party so much so that they knew that electing a Republican president would mean ending slavery. And that's why I would have supported Abraham Lincoln, because again, electing a Republican, ending slavery, that is a thing we can all agree on. Now I can see you guys typing in the comments already. He wasn't on the ballot in North Carolina. Bite me. 1864 gives me a little bit of reprieve because I no longer have to identify as a Republican. I can identify as a member of the National Union Party and support Abraham Lincoln once more. I would have definitely been looking in the direction of the Radical Democracy Party and Fremont there, but I don't know if I would have 100% supported them, because again, they didn't even manage to win. For those who don't remember, for those who don't know, John C. Fremont and a bunch of radical Republicans did contemplate running a candidate against Abraham Lincoln because they thought Abraham Lincoln was too moderate on the issue of slavery, but they ended up deciding to not to do so because they feared that it would show a divided front for the North, so it was best for them to remain united behind Abraham Lincoln. Rightfully so, rightfully so. 1868, I no longer have to have that reprieve because I'm back on the Republican train where I support Ulysses S. Grant. Why? Basically two reasons. One, there really was not any options. Like, there were really not that many options. It was literally him or the Democrat. There weren't, like, any other, like, happy other options. And the second one is that the Democrats in this cycle were definitely controlled by their racist roots. Like, they still had not gotten used to the idea of, like, black people having rights, so it was probably best to actively support the guy who didn't want to put them back in chains. And now this is going to be the most interesting part, because this is the first election where I have completely changed my mind on who I support. And when I say completely change my mind, I mean I literally completely changed my mind. Not even just I changed the candidate. I mean I have changed my entire political viewpoint in this election alone. Like, this election, I essentially used it as a throwaway thing to basically, like, I would support the woman, the first woman to run for president. But now I have not only done a complete 180 for that, but also a complete 180 from the last cycle, because by this time, Ulysses S. Grant, for those who don't remember, was involved in a lot of corruption scandals, so now I could not actively support him. And this is where it might get a little bit weird, because I started looking into the Liberal Republican Party, because one of the big things that was confusing for the Liberal Republicans to me was, like, who are they? Who are these people? I do not understand who these people are. And the TLDR is, technically, the Liberal Republican Party was a party of the more moderate faction of the GOP, but also they were a group of Republicans who were dissatisfied with Ulysses S. Grant, and it could be for a wide variety of reasons why they did so. And most of them were, again, of the moderate faction of the GOP, so definitely not necessarily my favorite faction, at least at the time period, because the radicals at the time were based as heck. But I tried to look into, like, what the Liberal Republicans actually wanted to see, like, are these guys as bad as I thought they were? Because, like, I usually just lumped them in with the Democrats, but, like, they really didn't, like, they weren't that bad. They were, like, basically on the same level as, like, Grant was to an extent. The only difference was that Grant had, like, the radical Republicans in his ear every so often, and the Liberal Republicans, they didn't. But the only difference was basically me learning about two figures within the party. So I'll just say this. In the primary for the Liberal Republican Party, I would have supported the senator from Illinois, Lyman Trumbull, and in the general election, I would have supported Horace Greeley. And the only reason why is, and this is sort of a spoiler for the next episode, Trumbull and Greeley were proto-socialists. Like, socialism had just become a thing at the time, and both of these people basically were proto-socialists. Like, Greeley, for those who don't know, like, Greeley has been, like, wildly popularized with the fact that he was, like a prominent utopian socialist at the time. But Trumbull was basically, like again, he was, like, a proto-socialist. He would eventually, like, lean into more socialist things later in his life, but he definitely had, like, inklings of it that were there. That's the only reason that I would have supported them. I couldn't care less about the history of the Liberal Republicans or, like, the factionalization or, like, whatever. Those are the only reasons why I would have supported the Liberal Republican Party in this election. And that sort of continues with the next couple of cycles, where I basically stay on the route of, like, minor parties for a while. In 1876, I would have supported Peter Cooper of the Greenback Party, because it's the democratic socialist, like, currency reform progressive option. 1880, I would have supported James B. Weaver, again of the Greenbacks. And not that long afterwards, I would have supported Benjamin Franklin Butler, again of the Greenbacks, in 1884. Benjamin Franklin Butler is interesting because he was, like, he used to be, like, a diehard, like, conservative Democrat, and then he became a member of the Radical Republicans. In 1888, the Greenbacks were sadly gone, so instead, I would have supported the candidacy of Alson Streeter of the Union Labor Party. Interestingly enough, the Union Labor Party actually managed to elect a member of the House of Representatives, what's his name? Henry Smith, I believe is his name, who was one of the first sewer socialists, essentially. 1892 is where that trend ends and kind of a new trend begins, because again, we have James B. Weaver, this time running under the newly established People's Party, or the Populists. It's basically a continuation of the Greenback Party, except for a more broad political appeal. With that, we end sort of like the post-Civil War era, like the immediate post-Civil War era, and now we enter a new era, the progressive / I guess still populist era. And, of course, I'm gonna have to say it, this is where things don't change again. For the 1896 cycle, I would have supported William Jennings Bryan. I still regret that I did not look more into him during school and only started getting love for him like after school was over. And by the next cycle, we're gonna have to see some new trends. You see, now, this is where we're gonna get into a little bit interesting, because now we're at the point where now I can't necessarily decide who I would have supported for the next couple of cycles. For 1900, I am legitimately deadlocked between William Jennings Bryan and Eugene V. Debs of the Social Democratic Party. I love both of these figures. I think both of these people are very fascinating people. They both got dedicated videos on my channel. Technically, I would ideologically align more with Eugene Debs, but William Jennings Bryan, it's not like William Jennings Bryan was like a bad candidate per se, but I guess it depends on the day. Like, it depends on how I feel on election day. Am I feeling practical or am I feeling ideological? Like, am I feeling idealistic or like practical in the real world? Is my head in the clouds or not? The 1904 cycle is similar. It's either Teddy Roosevelt of the Republicans or Eugene Debs of the Socialists. Again, idealism versus practicality. Maybe I would have voted for Teddy Roosevelt in this cycle just because he actually ends up winning. When I get finished with this like small section, I'll just explain point blank who I would have leaned towards. For 1908, William Jennings Bryan or Eugene Debs again. 1912, we get some interesting things as well. See, because not only do I have a split decision of who I would have voted for in the general, but I also have a split decision on who I would have voted for in the primaries. See, because there are actually two interesting candidates in both parties' respective primaries that I think would have been interesting to see. Teddy Roosevelt on the Republican side, obviously, and Champ Clark on the Democratic side. And come the general election, it would have been Roosevelt or Debs. Now, honestly, I'll just say this in this small section. I will just say who I probably would have actually leaned towards in the elections. 1900, I probably would have leaned still towards Bryan. You know, still like heavy, like he's still that spry, energetic congressman, and he had high hopes. He managed to secure the Democratic nomination almost unanimously, and Debs is like this newcomer. I don't know who this man is. So William Jennings Bryan would have been a lot more trustworthy of a choice. 1904, I probably would have leaned towards Teddy Roosevelt. It's not that I hate Debs, but again, a practicality sense kicks in. Teddy Roosevelt, he even managed to kind of earn the support of William Jennings Bryan. Bryan literally has praised Teddy Roosevelt. He didn't even run in the cycle because he likes Teddy Roosevelt. Ergo, I can see why I would probably still want Teddy Roosevelt. 1908 is where things are going to get tricky, because this is one where I would have probably leaned a lot more towards Debs. Bryan, I love the guy, but as I said in my video, he was not the young, spry congressman that he used to be. And so much so, he couldn't even follow with the party's left wing in the fact that he didn't even, drop support of a corrupt friend that he had. Debs would not have even had a corrupt friend. And in 1912, Teddy Roosevelt, I'm already in the route of going with the minor parties. With Teddy Roosevelt, at the very least, he has, a lot of momentum behind him. Debs, I still would have liked him. I still would have probably been to a couple of rallies to see how he is. But Roosevelt still had it. I think Roosevelt literally got, the post-endorsement or pre-endorsement from Vladimir Lenin. That is something interesting to note. Okay, 1916 is where things start getting a bit more, normal again. This one, I would have probably at least given some tepid support to Robert M. La Follette in the primary, and in the general election, I would have supported Alan L. Benson. Sadly, there's not really much else for this cycle, you see, because neither of these candidacies were really that big. La Follette, this was one of La Follette's biggest bids for office, and Alan L. Benson was basically the guy they put in there because Debs wouldn't run. 1920 is where things get a bit more interesting. For the primary, I would have probably backed Hiram Johnson, because Hiram Johnson definitely was continuing in that Roosevelt trend, and in the general election, no ifs, ands, or buts, Eugene Debs. I know he's in prison, and I know it stinks, but Debs definitely still has, Debs is definitely a good candidate nonetheless. 1924, again, primary, Hiram Johnson. General election, Fighting Bob. I literally have one of his buttons in my, thing. Definitely would have supported that guy. He even managed to get the support of the socialists. Very interesting endeavor. 1928 is where things are a little weird, because I did include somebody in the primary, but the thing is, I couldn't find anything to indicate that their primary bid was, legitimate or not. But in the sense that their primary bid is legitimate, I would have supported the candidacy of George Norris, the Republican-turned-independent senator, in the Republican primary. And the general election, I would have supported the socialist nominee, Norman Thomas. Again, their candidacies are not really that notable, because one, I don't even know if it exists, and the other is basically just Norman Thomas. Norman Thomas is cool. He's not as cool as Debs, no one is, but, he was definitely a good candidate. 1932 is where something very drastically changes. It's where you start to notice that there is from this point onwards, if you look at the version that I have, you notice that it gets a little less colorful from here on out, and it's basically monochrome. Monochrome as in one color, not in a, black and white thing. Okay, so for 1932, no ifs, ands, or buts, I would have supported Franklin D. Roosevelt. Hoover's trash. The idea of a New Deal is cool. A popular front looks interesting. So too does the coalition that he wants to propose. 1936. Now this is where things get interesting, because I'm actually going to name drop a couple of people who ran in the primaries. Not ones that I would have necessarily supported, but ones that I definitely would have been looking at and seeing, maybe these candidacies would have been interesting to see. And there are three different people in varying degrees of candidacies. First is Floyd B. Olson. For those who don't remember, Floyd B. Olson is a former Labor Party member of, he was a governor of Minnesota of the former Labor Party, and he's basically one of the most prominent socialist governors that the United States has ever had. I think he was the only thing that doesn't make him a socialist is the fact that he doesn't identify as a socialist. Everything else is essentially socialist of him. And it's not like he was anti-socialist. If he was anti-socialist, then I wouldn't even call him a socialist, but he basically ran on socialism without socialism. Many activists were interested in having Floyd B. Olson run a general election candidacy to Roosevelt's left. He's probably the only person who would have actually done that I would have actually considered supporting. Norman Thomas, I'll just be frank, he's not worth it. If it was Debs, maybe, and Earl Browder, it's nothing really against him. Actually, I guess technically something against him. He wasn't really that worth it either. The only other exception to someone who could have done that, and it might have been worth it, is Huey Long. Again, Huey Long, he's a little bit of a controversial figure. I know there's accusations of he's being he's somewhat fascistic, but it's Long is definitely an interesting figure, and I would have at the very least liked to see how he ran a candidacy against Roosevelt. And the last one is interesting because this is someone who technically ran against Roosevelt, Upton Sinclair. For those who don't know, Upton Sinclair, he was basically drafted to run for president in California under like some people who were like still part of like his End Poverty in California campaign of the 1934 election. He never formally ran, but this was in a time period where like you didn't necessarily have to formally run to actually be a candidate. As long as other people turned in the necessary paperwork, you would technically be a candidate. But due to the fact that none of these three candidacies ever panned out, I would have to still go with FDR. And spoiler alert, rest of the World War II, I'll go with FDR. New Deal and his response to World War II, you really just can't beat that, honestly. I mean, excluding the fact that I mentioned three people who could have beat that, but, you know. That last one, 1944, I will have to, I guess, give a brief mention to the debacle that was the VP contention. You see, because, for those who don't remember, there was a bit of a divide over, like, who FDR should have as his running mate. People, like, the more moderate members of the Democratic establishment wanted someone who was to Roosevelt's right. Meanwhile, Roosevelt, well, not necessarily Roosevelt, but, like, he had, like, a pretty firebrand left-winger named Henry Wallace as his vice president. And there was this huge divide over, like, who should be his running mate. And FDR basically just sat there and did nothing, and everyone else around him fought relentlessly over who should be his running mate. And in this debacle, I would have been one of the diehard Henry Wallace supporters, with the only exception to the rule would be if it's like, if he has to go, I would have chosen William O. Douglas to be his running mate instead, because both of those people are very much in the left-wing, diehard, firebrand, progressive types. And with that, I would then travel with Henry Wallace to the 1948 election with his Progressive Party. Now, technically, there was some people who were in the Democratic primary who were to the left of the establishment, but the fact of the matter is none of those candidacies ever panned out, so I would have just been diehard with Wallace. I won't be saying that in a couple of elections, but definitely I would have been with Henry Wallace in this cycle. 1952, things are a bit interesting because the Democrats are starting to win me back with the candidacy of Estes Kefauver, the person I put as my number 2 favorite senator, even though in retrospect he probably should have been at least number 3. But of course, the Democrats decided to rig the nomination against him, so I would have went back to the progressives and supported Vincent Hallinan candidacy, one of the few openly atheist candidates for president. Very interesting. 1956, I would have went right back to Estes Kefauver, but instead of making a turncoat for the general election, I would have actually stayed with the Democrats because of 3 reasons. 1, they didn't actually have to rig it this time. Like, Adlai Stevenson actually won the candidacy fair and square. 2, Adlai Stevenson is actually not that bad of a candidate. The only reason that I didn't back him in the last cycle is because Vincent Hallinan is better, and Stevenson rigged the nomination. And last but certainly not least, Kefauver was the running mate, so there was still the idea that he could pull Stevenson to his left. So, naturally, that's a very interesting option. The 1960 election, we actually get another addition, the primaries. I would have actually now decided that I would have backed. The only reason I didn't say anything prior was because I wasn't sure how serious and how broad the candidacy was. But now that I see all of the extent that the candidacy was, I can now say wholeheartedly, in the primaries, I would have backed Wayne Morse's candidacy. And the general election, I would have backed Kennedy. Shock of not shocks. 1964, we see Lyndon B. Johnson. This is one of those ones not only because LBJ's a pretty decent president, all things considered, but also there really was not any other options. 1968 is where we get a lot of options. The last time I made this subject, I basically gave a little bit of I gave tepid support to both McCarthy and Kennedy. For this one, I'm putting my foot down and just saying wholeheartedly, I would have been 100% a McCarthy guy. No ifs, ands, or buts. Not giving Kennedy a second glance. If Kennedy wanted my support, Kennedy should have ran day 1. And if McGovern wanted my support, he should have run on day 1. Now, the general election is where things get interesting, because when I made, like, you'll see it if you watch the one with Sunflower Socialists, when I say the candidate that I support, it's kind of like funny, because it's like, oh, this guy, I definitely did not expect this guy to be the candidate you supported. And the candidate is Dick Gregory, the candidate of the Freedom and Peace Party, not the Peace and Freedom Party, but the Freedom and Peace Party, a split-off faction of the Peace and Freedom Party, in literally the first election where they run. Now, here's the facts. Dick Gregory was constitutionally eligible to run for president. He also, I'm pretty sure, got more votes than Eldridge Cleaver, the official Peace and Freedom Party nominee. Legitimately, even though his candidacy was quote-unquote satirical, his candidacy was more serious than Eldridge Cleaver's was. So, I still feel justified in saying that I would have backed Dick Gregory. 1972 is where we get another big interesting thing, because we actually have, this is the one election that I'm completely envious over. This is the election where we had a vast amount of really good candidates. Like, I'm surprised that we had this many good candidates. Terry Sanford, Eugene McCarthy, Patsy Mink, Fred Harris, John Lindsay, Shirley Chisholm, Ben Spock, George McGovern, like, all these candidates were pretty good. Like, I am completely envious and floored with how many really good candidates we had this election cycle. But when push comes to shove, honestly, I would have to say that I would have supported Shirley Chisholm in the primaries. That's been completely consistent. But now I have to say I would have supported George McGovern come the general election. I know I badmouthed George McGovern a lot in the past, and I'll continue to do so because George McGovern is completely spineless, and Ben Spock does have a lot of good things. But honestly, I'll be fair in admitting, even though a lot of what I said about George McGovern was justified, I was a little bit too hard on him. I'll still call out the fact that he has no backbone and basically just let everybody walk all over him. But, you know, he's not as bad as I thought he was, at least as a candidate. You know, as a person, maybe not. I'm not voting for McGovern for his backbone. I'm voting for him for his policies. 1976, basically the same thing, except a little bit less good candidates. You know, we had Terry Sanford, Fred Harris, Frank Church. But honestly, in the Democratic primary, the one that I probably would have supported is just the one who had the most momentum. And that is Mo Udall. It didn't end up panning out, but, you know, I think Udall would have been an interesting choice for president. And come the general election, no ifs, ands, or buts again, even though this is when he started making his shift rightward, I would have still backed Eugene McCarthy. The 1980 election is where we start, like, 76 onward is when we start to see sort of like a pattern with me, which is a pattern that is probably going to continue with me ideologically forever, where, you know, basically it's the DSA, Working Families Party strategy, find the most left-wing Democrat and try to get them to be the nominee. Then when it comes to general election and that person is not the nominee, you know, back a progressive third-party option. And, you know, you would think that 1980 would be one where I don't do that, but no, I actually do that. I would have backed Ted Kennedy. I know I said in my original ones that Ted Kennedy, like, I wouldn't have backed him just because of the like, him not being a really good candidate, but, like, considering 2024, we might be faced with a similar situation, it's best to be like, yeah, I would have probably still supported Kennedy. Even though he was the least of all the Kennedys, I still think he was better than Carter to a degree, and Carter should have at the very least had that, like, primary bid against him. And in the general election, of course, I have to go with the no bullshit candidate himself, Barry Commoner of the Citizens Party. Heck, I'll even go so far as to say I would have been one of the people trying to get Ralph Nader to run for the Citizens Party candidacy. But as we know, Ralph Nader will never run for president. 1984, I think we had some good candidates here, but honestly, none of them are even remotely close to Jesse Jackson. Like, Jackson really truly is the candidate of the radical, I guess. The rest are sort of like Washington consensus, like, progressives, but Jesse Jackson was outside of the Washington consensus, so definitely more favorable to outsiders like me. And come the general election, I would have backed the Citizens Party candidate again, Sonia Johnson. 1988, similar story, Jesse Jackson in the primaries, and in the general election, I would have backed the now rebranded Consumers Party candidate, Eugene McCarthy. And it's funny because, as McCarthy states in an interview that at the press conference when he made his presidential announcement, he only ran because they asked him to. Nothing else. 1992 is another election where I've changed my mind again. See, I think in this election, I originally backed Lenora Fulani, but as Sunflower Socialist pointed out in the video that we did together, Lenora Fulani and the New Alliance Party was essentially this cult, and I did further research and I'm I probably wouldn't have backed them. Then I basically pretended the candidate I really would have backed would have been Ronald Daniels, but it's honestly I probably wouldn't have backed him either. Legitimately, after doing more research, I finally figured out people that I would have supported more than likely. You see, first in the primaries, I would have backed Tom Harkin. Tom Harkin was literally a pretty good progressive candidate that, honestly, it kind of stinks that he was overshadowed by some other people. Most of the anti-establishment voices went to Jerry Brown, even though Jerry Brown, I think this was when he decided to do another rebrand, because he ran for president 3 times, and the first one he ran as this left-wing radical, I guess. Not even necessarily left-wing radical, but it was definitely I'm an outsider. And then in the next cycle, he ran as I'm sort of the guy of balancing the budget. And then in the next cycle, he ran as a progressive firebrand. But in all 3 runs, he was basically seen as a political outsider. And even though Harkin, he actually, politically, he really was an outsider, but not in the sense of his job. And speaking of political outsiders, this is going to be an interesting turncoat, I'll say, but in the general election, I would have probably backed Ross Perot. You see, I've done a lot of research into Ross Perot, how his voters were, how his ideology is, and legitimately, I really don't see that much wrong with Ross Perot. He was proven right on NAFTA, and he was very much an interesting candidate. Granted, he is sadly of the vein of the Trumpster millionaire who buys their own candidacies. Definitely not necessarily a fan of him being this rich, powerful, bougie guy. But at the very least, Perot truly did represent a political outsider. He's the only centrist that I can actually say is sort of actually principled and good. And I will always defend the fact that Perot definitely did not spoil the election for against George Bush. He didn't spoil the election at all. I'll debate you and fight it every day. 1996, things started to get more recognizable. I would have backed Ralph Nader of the Green Party. Hey, wait a second. I thought he wouldn't run for president. We all know that wouldn't happen. And this is where I have to say get used to hearing that name. Because in 2000, I would have made the stunning decision to support the candidacy of Bill Bradley. Yes, I actually have bitten the bullet and decided I would have probably backed Bill Bradley in the primaries. Logistically, that's just something I would have done. I know there have been proposed better candidates in the election, Paul Wellstone was going to run for president, but he didn't end up doing it. Just Jackson floated his name out for a little bit and then didn't run as well. But Bill Bradley, he definitely had that crowd a little bit, even though he wasn't perfect 100%. And of course, in the general election, I would have supported the non-spoiler, Ralph Nader. 2004 and 2008, basically same situation. I'll just say both of them. In the primaries, I would have backed Dennis Kucinich, and the general, I would have backed Ralph Nader. Not much else to say there, honestly. 2012 is where we're going to get the last of the sort of interesting, I don't necessarily know who I would have backed and why. Because in the primaries, that's where things are going to get a bit more complicated. Because, in the primaries, I would have hypothetically supported John Wolfe Jr., though granted, I would have, liked any of the potential, left-wing challenges to Obama. But I do generally like John Wolfe Jr., at least platform-wise. Personal-wise, he's kind of mean to me. I don't know why. He was just this huge asshole to me, like in the last times I knew him. I really don't know why. And in the general election, I would have supported either Rocky Anderson of the Justice Party or Jill Stein of the Green Party. Both of these candidacies were really good and definitely harkened to like Obama's left, so I definitely would have probably backed them. 2016, we all know primaries. I was a Bernie bro 100%, and in 2016, I was Bernie or bust 100% with Jill Stein. I know there's some people in my audience who probably are like, you still support Jill Stein even though X, Y, and Z? Yes, 100%. I don't regret supporting Jill Stein in the past. I don't regret supporting the Green Party in the past. I don't regret anything. Even the wrong choices I made, there's no point in regretting your decisions. You made your decisions, and now you just have to accept that that's something you did, whether you like it or not. You can be mad that you didn't like it, but oh well, that's something you did. And in 2020, the only one of these people that I actually did manage to vote for, Bernie Sanders in the primary and Howie Hawkins in the general election. So yeah, those are all the people I would have voted for in every single presidential election up to this point. 2024? Well, we'll have to figure out what happens when that happens. Thanks for watching this video. Be sure to like, comment, subscribe, and click that bell to be notified when a future video of mine comes out. And if you need some more content from me, you can go on my website, follow me on Twitter, join my Discord, or consider supporting me on Patreon.